Hello everybody, it is fantastic to be back. First of all, can we have a huge round of applause for all the students that have helped put this together? Both organising all of the guests and the best tech team in the business at the back of the hall right there. We start, as is traditional, with our student panel. I'm going to ask the students to introduce themselves. We're going to start down at this end of the panel, who you are and what people ought to know about you, maybe something interesting about yourself.
Well, my name's Xavier, and I'm a keen physicist, so I'll be trying to bring maybe a little bit of science into this debate.
I'm Holly, and I don't really have an interesting fact about me. Not one that you guys want to hear about anyway. So I guess that's my interesting fact.
I think now they want to hear about it. And next to Holly.
And I'm Pardo, go to Merchant Taylors. I'm essentially a historian. In terms of interesting facts, I have a weird niche obsession with the Labour Party in the 1960s and 70s. I'd see if that's useful to know.
I think you can get cream for that. That's absolutely fine. Very lovely to have you. And this side of our panel, we have...
I'm Anna, and I currently study history, English, philosophy and religion, and geography at Westminster School. And my interesting fact is that I'm a former youth representative for my Labour constituency in my local area.
Go. And our final panellist.
Hi, I'm Tyler, and I'm the Deputy Chair of the Beaconsfield Young Conservatives.
Your student panel. Thank you. Our question, and it is a very large and pressing question indeed, is how do we solve or tackle, if you like, the cost of living crisis, and indeed, is the government doing enough? Xavier, let's start with you.
All right, well, I think, first of all, to tackle the cost of living crisis, you need to look at what's caused it, and I think that it's been pretty clear that that the massive spending throughout the coronavirus pandemic in order to sort of keep the economy moving has finally taken its effect with all the quantitative easing that's caused this. And so really, obviously, the solution is not more spending, which is what the government's sort of trying to do right now, but I think that there needs to be more of a focus on actually giving more increasing the amount of money that people have, because trying to simply take away the amount the government takes away from you
There is a warming up the crowd. I should have done it, really, shouldn't I? That's kind of my role, I suppose. And if you don't agree, I don't think we'll do the other thing. But if you agree, let's show some support for our student panelists. Xavier's first contribution. Anna, your thoughts?
So in rebuttal to that, or just giving an outline?
Whether you agree or disagree.
Well, I agree in the fact that we need to look at what's massively underpinning this crisis. But I think that something that has hugely influenced kind of the cost of living is fuel. And I think that fuel stress is a major factor in creating big spending inconveniences for many families across the country. And this is a result of economic reopening because the cost of oil and gas has more than tripled in the last 2 years. And I think that the government needs to massively accelerate their investment into renewable energy. Because I think that when we look at the statistics, the predictions in the cost of renewable energy, it was predicted to fall by 2.6% in a decade. However, the reality is that it has fallen by 15%, and I think this shows incredible promise for the future and incredible promise as to how cheaply we can run our country. And I think that it feeds into a kind of a positive cycle of as you deploy more renewable energy sources, the prices fall, there's more market competition, and the demand increases. And and it also adds jobs, and I think that it can be very easily achieved if the UK kind of just opens up its investment and opens up potentially even borrowing money from other countries to institute the facilities that can allow us to operate in a cost-efficient and environmentally friendly way.
Very much. So Xavier's somewhat cautious on spending. Investment in renewables Cardo, where do you stand on this?
So in terms of the last 2 points, I think I agree we need to look at the cause behind the cost of living crisis. And therefore I think it's vital from the outset that we try to inoculate ourselves from this notion, which is emerging from the government's rhetoric, that somehow the shortage in supply lines, particularly of fuel, which was mentioned, is primarily a product of the sanctions which we've imposed as a result of Russia's invasion of Ukraine. So I think from the outset, and I hope that we can have broad consensus on that point, that actually the shortages we're witnessing predate recent events. In terms of why they predate them, I think there is something to be said that, again, it's not even a product of the last decade of austerity which we've witnessed, but perhaps something more fundamental, a fundamental deficiency in our way of, in the manner in which our economy is structured and regulated. And I think solutions at boosting production and making it more equitable definitely go a long way. In terms of some potential solutions, I would be of the persuasion that cutting taxes would give the necessary stimulation, especially if we cut corporation tax, I think, to small and medium-sized businesses. Something which hasn't been mentioned, a solution to the fuel issue, fracking, which I'm sure we could get onto.
Temperature in the room for fracking? Where are people on fracking? Pro fracking? Anti? Okay. You might have to win people around on fracking, it seems.
And then build more houses and some pretty other uncontroversial stuff. Yeah.
House building. Thank you very much indeed. Holly, you've heard a few different things.
Yeah.
You can either come in on something you've heard or give us your own idea.
I think I'm going to disagree with everyone here, which is pretty much what I do anyway. I think I'm going to take a few points. I think the man on my right is completely right that it's nothing to do with COVID or anything, or the war in Ukraine. There's not. I mean, it's clearly accelerated the process, but it's definitely not like the start of the process that we've been living in. I mean, the quantitative easing that we put in place to save the economy didn't really do much apart from save shares in the stock market. They didn't really help the people. I mean, I watched a very good documentary about what the decade the rich won, and I think it was completely correct. The poor didn't really win from the financial crisis of 2008. So I agree that it didn't begin with COVID and the war in Ukraine, but I completely disagree with fracking and cutting taxes. Cutting taxes on the poor, sure, but cutting taxes on corporation for middle businesses. I mean, there's people, what do you class as a middle business, first of all? And the business owners are clearly going to have a lot more money than the poorer people who are working and exploited by them. What you really need is a windfall tax on the companies like BP and Shell, who got $40 billion in profits and gave £6 billion to their shareholders just in February, the 6th of February, they gave £6 billion to their shareholders. And you've seen. I mean, I started driving in September. Petrol prices was $1.39 Asda at the Handicross. It's now $1.57 after the 2p reduction. It went down from the 5p cut in fuel duty. So I completely disagree with everyone. Although investing in renewables is great, and borrowing money from other countries, great. But we've got a huge amount of debt. So, I mean, borrowing money from other countries is not great. What we really need to do is just tax the rich.
Very much. On the question of corporation tax, Cardo, quick right to reply if you wish to, or I'll bring Tyler in.
Well, when I talk about what the corporations I'm identifying are not BT and Shell, but rather sort of emerging businesses who are struggling, in fact, to emerge, who, if the necessary stimulus was provided by cutting their corporation tax, the burden was lifted, they would be able to increase employment levels in certain regions. They would, and it would contribute to a culture of aspiration within the economy, which I think would be wise to emulate as an aspiration. But I agree in the short term, there are perhaps more pressing solutions which we could look at.
Thank you. Tyler, your thoughts?
Well, I would just say that the main issue with the cost of living crisis has been inflation. And the main cause of this unprecedented rise in inflation has been the unprecedented rise in the cost of fuel. And that has been obviously the obvious factor is that we've sanctioned the Russian oil and effectively cut our supply while we still have a growing demand. So the cost of energy is therefore going to rise, and that has impacted every business. So if every business is having an increased cost, that cost is going to be put on the consumer and increase inflation. So I don't believe that taxing companies is going to solve this issue, because all you're doing is adding an extra cost to these businesses, which is just going to further increase the rate of inflation and affect the people who are most vulnerable of that. So I disagree with your point there.
What would you like to see? What would be some of your potential solutions?
Well, what the government's done in the short term is that they've offered financial support to those on low incomes, such as lowering national insurance, which will save £330 a year. They've also increased the living wage, which is going to increase the annual salary of people on living wage by £1,000 a year. There's also an 8.6% cut in fuel duty. In addition, they've also frozen TV licences for the next 2 years, and the universal credit taper has gone from 63% to 55%. And this is all designed to increase the income of the people who are most affected by the increase in living costs, and also reduce the amount that they have to give to the government through taxation. So that's the short-term solutions this government's doing. And then in the long term, the government's looking at the best way to do this is increase our energy supply to become more energy independent, as that will drop the cost of energy, drop the cost of businesses across the UK, and therefore it should support those on low incomes as goods will be cheaper, and that will support the whole country.
Thank you, Tyler. Anna, is that enough?
Well, I think that, yes, while some of that is relevant, I think the point about taxes is extremely contradictory, especially when you take into account that a lot of this argument is kind of based around an environmental standpoint, because surely you do not think that tax is something that can be used as a huge deterrent to companies that are kind of outputting big amounts of fossil fuels, or encouraging companies to go renewable and encouraging them to save money with energy. So do you think that tax does not apply to that at all?
Well, I think the renewable look is better for the long term, but for the short term, you have to see we need to get our supply of energy up. The fastest way to do that is in fossil fuels at the moment, which is why the government has stopped them. They were going to fill the quadrilla fracking sites with concrete. The government's blocked that. Also, the government's fast-track nuclear power plants that Rolls-Royce, a British company, is doing. And they're also increasing the imports of liquid natural gas from the States.
Okay. Sorry, Holly, on that?
Yeah, I completely agree that the oil, sanctions on oil has increased the price, but that is not where the problems lay. The price of oil skyrocketed way before we put our sanctions on Russia, and we only use 6% of only 6% of our energy comes from Russian oil anyway, or 6% of our oil supply comes from Russia. So there's absolutely no reason why that should have a huge effect that it has right now. And £330 a year, what do you think that's going to buy people? I mean, petrol costs £50 a week now, for me anyway. I mean, that's not going to buy the poorest people anything. I mean, the taxes are not, the taxes, the national insurance is taper going down does not mean that people are going to have more money in their pockets, because inflation is completely skyrocketing out of control. I mean, this is the worst thing we've seen since the 70s. This was the winter of discontent, you know? It's not going to fix anything just cutting taxes or stopping taxes on the poorest people. It's just not going to do anything. And also, to combat your point, yes, of course, a windfall tax is on its own is just going to increase inflation, obviously. If you have combine a windfall tax along with price caps, that will completely just help the poorest people of our country. Like nurses and carers can't afford to drive to work anymore. Like that is the problem right now. That you can't have an NHS that is functioning, and you can't have all of these new taxes that are funding the NHS without a working NHS. You know, you can't have workers if they can't drive to work. And obviously fuel is not the only problem, but that is really driving up costs right now. People are trying to stay at home more, or so that they don't go out. People are not buying essentials. 32% of people are just not going to go out and buy non-essentials, like nappies and stuff. They're just going to buy reusable nappies. Great, but also people are not going to want to do that all the time. I mean, non-essentials are like what fuels our economy. If people aren't going to go out and buy them, there's no economy going, and we just get stagnation again.
Other panelists, is Holly right? And if not, why is she wrong?
Well,
your thoughts?
I don't know if you misheard or struggling with simple addition. But the energy cap has increased. This will put costs up by £693 a year. And as I said, the saving from income tax will save £377 a year. The increase in living wage will increase by £1,000 a year. There's also a household support bill, which will give £1 billion worth of support to the poorest households. TV licences are frozen, 8.6% cut in fuel duty.
So I can't. Other panelists, ready yourself, but I can't not give Holly a quick reply to such a robust challenge.
First of all, you did mention £330, and that is another thing that the government does. And also, even that is not going to do anything. I mean, the £1,000 is not going to do anything. £1 billion spread across the entirety of the UK is not going to do anything. You're not living the same life as a poor person is. I don't think. Otherwise, you wouldn't have this argument. Because you can't live off £330 extra a year. And also, who is on the living wage? Tell me, who's on the living wage? Because the living wage is not the minimum wage. The minimum wage is far below what the actual living wage should be. The living wage increasing by 8% isn't great when inflation is up to like 15%, is it now, or something? Not 15%, sorry, yeah, it's 8%, right. But it could increase up to 15%. I mean, it's not going to do anything.
So you say minimum wage has gone up, or living wage has gone up 8%, and you say inflation's gone up 8%. Where's the issue then?
Well, inflation goes up as wages rise. That's just how economics works. If you increase wages, the inflation goes up. If you increase wages again, inflation goes up. It's always going to keep increasing.
Increasing minimum wage or not then?
I'm saying, obviously, minimum wage is not where it should be, but I'm saying implement windfall taxes and price caps on fuel, on petrol and not on fuel. I'm saying price caps stay at where they're capped, not move them up by 54% or whatever they've moved up recently. Stay where they are. You don't need $40 billion worth of profits or in the last year. You don't need that much money. I mean, the patriotic million...
Just there, whether there might be agreement in the room for that last point, we'll see, but Anna's going to come in.
Just on the topic of minimum wage, it's been shown that any increase below 60% off the median or current wage does not actually incur noticeable changes in employment or necessarily noticeable deficits to the economy. So I think that definitely in terms of reducing the cost of living, upping the minimum wage is definitely a solution that should be looked into long term. As no current planned increase would actually incur many long-term problems.
Hey, Zafir, from what you've heard, you at first were sceptical about spending increases. Yeah. Has anybody convinced you? And if not, why not?
Well, I definitely say that the long-term investment into renewable energy is a good idea. I think, as I think Tyler was saying, energy independence I think is definitely important, so that we can levy these sanctions against countries like Russia. But on the point of raising the minimum wage, I think that the problem with that is that, as I think someone said earlier, that there are smaller businesses to medium-sized businesses are struggling right now. There's massive amounts of jobs that are currently not being filled, and so putting pressure on a lot of those smaller businesses, lots of your news agents, your tradespeople, they're going to suffer a lot from that, because the big companies can tank that. They can take a little bit out of their profits, BP, Shell, they can deal with that. But the real sort of solution to this is trying to get wages to go up on their own naturally, which is sort of quite a hard thing to do. But as inflation goes up, wages do go up. Yeah.
Okay. Ricardo, not been in for a while. Anything that you've heard kind of grabbed you or repelled you, or what do you think?
So I certainly agree with the point that the long-term solution is investment in renewable energy. But perhaps I wonder what my colleagues here would say. But perhaps as a short-term solution, possibly the government should look into suspending the phasing out of coal, considering all the problems which we've been pointing out. And on the point about small and medium-sized businesses, I thoroughly endorse that as well.
So suspend that, you think we need to look at coal production in the short term?
Yes, yeah, to suspend it, the planned phasing out of it as a short-term solution, as a way station until the point where we can actually receive the benefits from investing in renewable energy.
So cost of living crisis for you would in the short term trump the climate crisis?
Well, I don't think there is necessarily a dichotomy. I think provided regulations were in place, and obviously that's itself a topic of discussion. Again, we are pointing out, and some more passionately than others, quite dire straits which people are finding themselves in. And if a short-term solution is to look into coal production, then I think we should at least consider it.
Okay. Should we sharpen this slightly? A couple of panellists have mentioned about the impact this has had on the poorest in society. The money-saving expert chap, Martin Lewis, very memorably a couple of times recently, has said that he's at the ends of what he can do, and he thinks this requires more radical action. I don't think he was necessarily impressed with all of the responses. Panellists' thoughts on, do politicians actually understand what it's like for people with the least? And is that a structural problem in our democracy? Holly?
I absolutely don't think they understand. I mean, there are obviously a few people who will understand. There are a few MPs who are working as GPs and stuff, but they earn so much more money. They just have voted to have another pay increase to up to £80,000. That's not what the poorest people of society are living on. Poorer people are living on £20,000, £15,000, £10,000. That is not enough to get by, and politicians don't seem to understand that they want to work, they want to go out and work, and they can't. The more they go out and work, the more the benefits go. The more they go out to work, the more that they have to pay in petrol. The more they go out to work, the more that they have to, go to social events. People want to do these things, and they don't have enough money to go and do these things, and they don't have time to do these things if they're working at all times. Politicians don't understand. You ask them to go to what the price of milk is. Margaret Thatcher, that was her thing, knowing the price of milk. Politicians didn't know what that was, and I don't think politicians have any clue as to how the poorest people are going on. They try and sympathise, of course, and a lot of people do have some kind of understanding, but they've never, well, not never, they're not living in a time of real crisis. They're not living on £20,000 a year.
Yeah, it's a fair point. I mean, just briefly, just to start, and then absolutely bring you in. You mentioned some of the initiatives the government have done. Someone as wealthy as the Chancellor, as Rishi Sunak, can he understand what it's like for some of the kinds of people that have to ring Martin Lewis and are looking for help with the basics, do you think? Can he empathise with that?
Well, of course, Rishi is quite wealthy, but he's also a very good economist, and he understands that the external influences on the economy, he understands how that's going to impact the poorest, and that is why he's put in these schemes to help improve the situation these people are in. So just because someone didn't grow up in poverty doesn't mean they can't understand and come up with solutions. And also, if you look at the cabinet, Priti Patel, I don't know what the opinion on her is, but she did.
I think we have some people who might tell you.
But she did immigrate to the UK with very little money because her family had a farm in Uganda which was taken off by the government. And then also you look at the education secretary, he's a Syrian refugee, he's come over with barely anything. And you work your way up, and that is the whole point of capitalism. You can have nothing, and you can work hard and grow yourself financially and be in a position like they are.
Thank you. I'm going to ask as we come to the, sadly, as we come towards not quite at the end of the student panel, towards the end of the student panel, I'd like each of our panellists to try and sum up if you were in a position of power. If you were Rishi Sunak and you were there filling up what's possibly your actual car at the petrol forecourt, and you could come up with the thing that you'd like to see or a policy and reduce it to a couple of words, what words do you think should be the priority? If that is not too tough a task, but what a panel. If you're going to give anybody a challenging task, it would be this panel. Somebody want to pitch in? I want a couple of words from each of you to round this off. What would you do? Go on, Holly, start with.
I have 3 words. Tax the rich.
Anyone ready with their 3 words? How do you got 3 words for us?
Cut taxes and promote aspiration in the Gladstonian tradition.
Much indeed. Anna, your pithy suggestion?
I think long-term green solutions.
Chaps on either end. Xavier, you got your...
Well, I'd say restructure the tax system to tax rates on revenue rather than profit. That's an A-level answer. And Tyler?
I'd say energy independency is the best way to go forward, as the cost of energy underpins the cost of all products across the economy. So if you can get cheap energy by being independent, then that's the best way forward.
Gotcha. That was the student panel. Please show your appreciation. I believe in the time-honoured phrase, there will now be a short intermission.
We'll make this
Sorry for it.
Any more introductions to be made? No? I'm going to stand up because I'm so delighted, honoured and excited to see you all here today. You know, it is, well, more than 2 years since I was here last. We were going to have an event in March 2020, which, for reasons which you may remember, got cancelled. But I was here in 2019, and I think probably in 2015 as well, so this is my third time. And it's really wonderful, as has been said already, to see you all here and to know that we are actually en masse, face-to-face. No video muting. We can talk freely amongst ourselves, and with any luck, we can talk intelligently amongst ourselves as well. So I have a very distinguished panel here. We have a very distinguished panel, and we're going to talk about things that matter, I hope, to you and to us, and to arrive at some conclusion. So on my extreme right, we have Toni Brodelle. You all have brief biographies in your program, so I won't go through that again. But just to say welcome, Toni, lovely to see you. And maybe next time I see you will be a Liberal Democrat MP. Who knows, who knows. And on my right is Peter Ford, His Excellency Peter Ford, who's the erstwhile our man in Syria, and before that in Bahrain, yes?
Correct.
And has been retired for some time, but is nevertheless a keen follower of international affairs. On my far left, we have Mark Brown, who, again, you will see is the chair of the Cooperative Party in Bucks, Trade Union Liaison Officer for Buckingham, and a hopeful candidate for Labour MP. Is that not right? Yes, it is. And on my left, someone whom you probably will not recognise, is my dear friend and colleague, Earl Attlee, John Attlee, who has had a very distinguished and long career in the House of Lords, and also has been a fighting man in the TA, who served in Bosnia and in Syria, I think. Did you not? Iraq. Bosnia and Iraq. So here we all are, and we've got a list of questions, and I'm going to start off the process by reading out those questions and then asking those, not reading them up, asking those who have put them down to stand up and let yourselves be known and let our panel know what it is you have on your mind. So, can I please ask Adrian Brown to stand up? Is Adrian here? Yes, Adrian, your question, please.
Hello. My question's a very short question. Has war in the Ukraine saved Boris Johnson?
It may be a short question, but it has got a very, very long history. Thank you so much indeed. So let me go to you, Peter. The question is, has war in Ukraine saved Boris Johnson?
For the moment, it appears that Johnson is emerging with credit, wrongly in my view, but the general view of the media appears to be that Johnson is having a good war, and that he is likely to emerge unscathed from the Partygate scandal, which the war is, of course, a great distraction away from. But I think as the war progresses, it will be seen that Johnson is a pale imitation of the Churchill that he's attempting to channel. He's a Poundland Churchill.
Well said, well said.
I'll quit while I'm here.
Mark, how about you?
I think I'd agree that it's a temporary stay of execution, but I think myself, the Labour Party, and I think many people in the country cannot believe the way the pandemic was handled so badly. So many billions wasted on PPE contracts that didn't go anywhere. We won't forget that. There is a war, and we unite as a country, and we want to support Ukraine as much as possible, but at the end of the day, the war's not the only thing going on. The cost of living crisis, all the other issues we have to face. We remember how we handled the pandemic, and we will remember after this conflict what needs to be done, I think.
Toni, to you, but I mean, basically, do you think that now might be a time when we should be changing our government?
Absolutely. I think it's, this is long overdue. And just to come back to the points that have been raised about Boris Johnson, I think we're deluding ourselves, and he's deluding himself if he thinks that this is the first and last scandal. We've lived this government now from scandal to scandal to scandal. There used to be a time when you would have a quiet week in politics. Now we don't get a quiet hour in politics. And, I'm not somebody who's a career politician. I came into politics because I was stunned. I've worked for 21 years in education and the empowerment of young people. And I was stunned to see the way that the caliber of politicians, there are politicians I would fundamentally disagree with on a political level, but you would respect that they respected the office. And I was looking at what was happening and seeing that there are a whole raft of politicians who were charlatans. Boris Johnson is the head of that, and a fish rots from the head down, right? And I think that we have a cabal of politicians at the moment, particularly in the Conservative Party, and particularly the government that we have right now, who are ill-qualified and who do not respect the office and the privilege of serving as public servants. And I do not think this is going to be the last scandal. I think, as you said, a Poundland Churchill's, absolutely. I think Boris Johnson has kind of aspired to that. He's got this very kind of, this vision of himself, very narcissistic vision of himself. And I really think that's something. It's not going to be the last scandal. I think it's delayed the process. That everyone's attention is kind of focused on the Ukraine, as understandably so. But this will not be the last scandal.
You are the only one who can possibly defend Johnson. So over to you, John.
I shall try to defend him very hard. Short answer is yes. I'm afraid I'm not Boris's greatest fan. However, I think it's essential that he stays in place. We only have to think what Mr. Putin wants right now. He wants a Prime Minister of the United Kingdom who is in an unstable position. What we need is a Prime Minister who's in a stable position. We also need to think about the position of President Zelensky, who's doing a fabulous job of running his country, but he needs to be confident that our Prime Minister is going to stay in place. He's clearly got a rapport, but there's a rapport between President Zelensky and our Prime Minister, and that rapport has been put in place for some time, clearly certainly last year. The Prime Minister and the Defence Secretary, Ben Wallace, they've made the right call. They saw the war coming. They made sure that the Ukrainians were armed with effective weapons. Not only did they give them the weapons, not only did they make sure that our people showed them how they work, how to fire them, but they also gave them the tactics so they could use them effectively. As for Toni's point about there will be another scandal, I just hope not.
I'm going to, we have a related question here, which I'm going to ask Chris Staveley to say, but before I do that, can I just find out from the audience, how far do you think that the war in Ukraine has saved Boris, and does that, any hands up? Very, very few. You think, does that mean that you don't think Boris is saved? Hands up.
Hands up if you think that Boris has been saved.
The question we have is, has the war in the Ukraine saved Boris Johnson, which we've been talking about? I want to know what the audience thinks about that. Has the war saved Boris Johnson? Yes. So do you think he's going to continue to be saved? No. Okay. All right. Fine. So, okay, I'm going to ask Chris to stand up. Where's Chris? Is Chris here? Chris Staveley? Yes. Could you ask your question, please?
Okay, still on Ukraine. It's another
Yes.
short question. Should we seek regime change in Russia?
John?
Short answer is no, we shouldn't. We should carry on the policy that we've got, which is to support Ukraine and its armed forces. But the future of the President of Russia, Mr. Putin, that's a matter for the Russian people.
Peter?
It's presumptuous, to say the least, to think that we could decide who should be the president of Russia or anywhere else. But this, I'm afraid, is typical of our mindset. We've gotten, us in the West, into the habit of regime change, and it hasn't worked out very well for Iraq or Libya, earlier Yugoslavia, and it hasn't worked out well for us in Syria because the regime hasn't changed despite our best efforts. So to even think in these terms of undermining the leader of another country is presumptuous and dangerous. Dangerous. If you, what I
Say why it's dangerous.
What I deplore about the debate in this country at the moment around Ukraine is that it's infantile. We're not taking seriously the risk to this country. Forget for a moment the poor people of Ukraine. They're the victims in all this, caught in the middle between two strong powers. But what about our security and our prosperity in Britain? I don't hear much from any of our political class, whether they're conservative or Labour or Liberal, voicing concern about the possible risks to us, about the risk of us getting dragged into an armed conflict. Remember, the 1914-18 war wasn't wanted by anyone, but the countries got onto a slide. And that's where we are, if we're not careful. And to talk about changing the government of Russia encourages this slide. Wake up, people.
Yeah. Mark.
Well, it's Her Majesty's government should never interfere at that kind of level in other countries' politics. Of course not. I think we all agree on that. I do think there is a case for supporting democracy in Russia in better ways. Protesters are being arrested in huge numbers. They are being imprisoned and taken away from their families. People in Russia cannot voice their opinions. I mean, I think many of us have seen, these footage, of someone saying a single word or phrase on the Red Square and being led away. If you are a liberal democratic country, then you have a duty to want to spread those liberal democratic values elsewhere. Now, I don't agree we should, that Iraq or Syria or some of our other adventures in other places always worked out. We all know that, and we all know the consequences. But we still have a duty to do that in other ways, by creating platforms for people in Russia to share their views here, perhaps. Through the BBC, for example, making the BBC available in Russia through the Tor network, which is a kind of dark web kind of way of accessing free and impartial news and information. We can do subtle, effective ways of supporting people like that. But regime changes, it's a bit dated now. We don't do that sort of thing.
So it's a soft power approach,
yes,
really.
Absolutely.
Toni, Denbu.
So first of all, I kind of flip the question and think, how would we feel if another government decided that they wanted to change our government? No matter how much we dislike our government, I really think that's a matter for us. I kind of agree a lot with what Mark has said, actually. One of the things, I've been very involved with the Syrian conflict for many, many years now. And one of the things that I've said since the beginning, much as I dislike the Assad regime and actually work to gather evidence for war crimes trials, I do believe that the work that we do, as Mark said, is supporting those people who are seeking for their human rights to be recognised. I believe that we should be, you know, it's not for us to decide the fate of the government of another sovereign country. I do, however, also believe that, you know, when you were talking about the cost, Peter, to the UK and talking about our prosperity, I do think we need to understand, and having seen Putin throughout years of intervention in Syria, the same playbook is being enacted now in Ukraine, and I do think we need to be really aware of the very real intentions that Putin has in relation to Europe, in relation to the West. Does that mean that we should seek regime change? No, I don't believe so, but I do think that we should be supporting those who are seeking more democratic recognition and human rights recognition within Russia and surrounding Russia.
Thank you very much, absolutely. John, you wanted to come back here?
We asked the question, why would we not want to replace Putin? The first issue is, if we replaced him, or he was replaced by the Russian people, or the question is, who is going to replace Putin? Who's going to be any better? Peter talked about the risk of escalation, and he's absolutely right. And one of the decisions we were very careful about was the MiG-29 decision to not give the Ukrainian army, the armed forces, MiG-29, because it might escalate. And we don't know at our level the calculation that the governments will make about the effect of giving MiG-29, but I personally think it's the right decision. But as for supporting the Ukrainians, supposing Russia did take over and had succeeded in taking over Ukraine, and I do not believe that they will be able to do that, and I'll no doubt come on to that. But if they did, what next? We've got the Baltic States, the Kaliningrad enclave, Russian enclave, that has no land connection to Russia. And then there's Poland next, and there are strategic reasons related to the gap between the Baltic Sea and the Carpathian Mountains, why the Russians might, for strategic reasons, want to take over Poland. So the best thing to do is to stop the aggression where it is by very carefully supporting the Ukrainian government and trying to doing everything we can to bring this conflict to a stop as fast as possible. Not only are we seeing the tragedy of the families, the mothers and children escaping the conflict, but what pains me as someone with military experience is the fact that when I see a tank with its turret blown off, I know what happened in that tank, and it was the fact that those lovely young men in that tank, whichever side it is, they were vaporized in a fraction of a second. So it is essential that we try and bring this conflict to a close as soon as possible, but not at the risk of allowing further conflict.
Can
I'm very aware of what Peter said about we are in a very dangerous context at the moment, and there was a debate in the House yesterday in which this was underlined and stressed, is that Putin is unlikely to give in and give up, in part because he's so isolated, he's not taking advice from anyone, and therefore he can maintain his, it's what happened to Mao Zedong during the Great Famine in China, that no one was brave enough to give him the truth about what's happening to people in the country starving, by their millions. So, and the conclusion is that it is likely that this war is going to go on for quite some time. There's no easy solution. There's no quick solution. So it is dangerous. Is there any argument at all, I'm talking to you, Peter, for encouraging some kind of action to get rid of Putin?
I'm frankly amazed that people presume to know Russia's war intentions better than those that are being declared by Putin himself, or that people fear an attack on a series of NATO countries. You don't have to be an expert analyst to see that there is a huge difference between Ukraine, not, thankfully, a member of NATO, and countries which are. Putin is surely not insane, and if he is as insane as some people claim, then all the more reason for us to be careful. Listen to our own rhetoric. No. Any sober analysis shows that Russian war aims are limited to increasing their influence in Ukraine. In Ukraine. Stop there. The red line is drawn around the NATO countries. And the influence in Ukraine is limited to wanting Ukraine to have a status like Austria or Finland. Is that really so terrible? Is it the end of the world if Ukraine doesn't have the option of joining NATO, if they turn out to be like Austria or Finland? Is that worth dying for? Is that worth risking the future of your own families if we get dragged into the conflict for the sake of preserving Ukraine's option to join NATO? Because that is what is at stake. Let's be clear about what's at stake. Not the future of democracy in the West. Let's not be hysterical. It is about a narrow set of geopolitical interests in Ukraine. And what we should be doing is encouraging a sensible settlement. We could have had it before the violence started, the neutralization, demilitarization of Ukraine, and then the Russians would leave in exchange for the lifting of sanctions. That is where it's headed anyway. And the sooner we face up to that reality, the better.
How much damage has done to Ukraine, though?
Yes.
Can I respond to that?
And so the question is how much damage. I mean, that's really, really important, because it's not just a question of Putin, resisting the NATO's involvement in Ukraine. He actually wants to occupy Ukraine. And he wants to take. I mean, it's the old sort of imperial Russia idea. And the damage.
We need to have an evidence-based discussion. You're making an assertion.
But we do have evidence. This is not the first time this has happened.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
I mean, where does
Do
it
we
stop?
have the evidence?
Afghanistan,
Crimea, Donbass.
I mean, even in talking
Kiev.
about Putin, Putin's
Donbass,
actions, and even talking
being
about
cornered into the position of appearing to be an apologist for Putin. It's almost impossible in this country to have a sensible, rational debate.
No, I think you're being challenged with people
this
that are disagreeing
issue.
with you, and I think that's
I'm sorry.
important. That's exactly the right
Mark,
that we're
come in on this.
Russia has not and will surely not invade a NATO country.
Well, it will stop countries, sovereign nations, or try to stop sovereign nations joining NATO, so that potentially then isn't an issue. My issue here is that Putin has form on this, and I still stand by the fact that we shouldn't be seeking regime change in terms of Russia, much as I am no fan of Putin. But I do think that you've kind of said two things that are almost at odds with one another in saying that Russia as a sovereign nation, we shouldn't be seeking regime change. Rightly, I agree with you, but then saying that, that Ukraine Ukraine has the right to self-determination to seek membership of NATO. And who is anybody else to say that shouldn't happen? You're saying, would it be so awful? Well, that's not your decision to make.
Peter, I'll come back to you. Let me hear from Mark, and then very quickly from John. Mark.
I understand where you're coming from. I think none of us here want conflict or war with Russia. We all want to avoid this at all costs, particularly donors of the Conservative Party. We don't want this. We don't want the situation to be here. But at some point, you have to stop appeasing someone who clearly we don't know where he would end. Would he end at Ukraine? Would he not, potentially think, well, Estonia, Latvia, or any of those other countries next? We don't know.
Well, what Peter is saying is there's no evidence for that.
There is, and there might not be, but I think there's some evidence in seeing that he can act in aggressive, unilateral ways, which even his partners
as
in
happened
China
in Crimea.
As in Crimea.
Crimea
Even
is
his partners aren't consulted on. China has great doubts about this. And China has been their cheerleader. They work closely, especially in the last 10 years.
That may not last.
Then.
John?
The first point, of course, is that Ukraine cannot join NATO. The reason Ukraine can't join NATO is it has a border dispute. And if you have a border dispute, you can't join NATO, I think it's for at least 10 years. The problem I foresee is that, yes, we can agree, or the Ukrainians can agree, it's the Ukrainians to decide what solution they're prepared to accept. But they could agree to give up the Donbass, give up the Crimea permanently, and also agree not to join NATO. But Putin already had most of the Donbass, he already had the Crimea, and as I said, there's no chance of Ukraine joining NATO anytime soon. So I worry that there's nothing that he can be given. So I can't see an easy solution in the short term.
I think that's
He sacrificed 15,000 men to get what he already had.
And that's a really good point, 15,000 men. We shouldn't forget that. They may be Russian and some, they keep talking about Russophobia. I'm no Russophobe, I love Russians, but these are 15,000 roughly. We don't know exactly what the count is, but 15,000 people died on the Russian side, just on the Russian side. Was that worth it? Was that worth it?
I'm going to give Peter a word, and then I'm going to ask you what you think.
Well, look, I conclude that we in this country and in the West are ready to fight to the last Ukrainian. We're not ready to fight ourselves, but we're ready to fuel the conflict. We're ready to stiffen Zelensky's resolve not to make a compromise, despite the fact that that will result in many more than 15,000 deaths of Ukrainians. We're ready to fight to the last Ukrainian. We can be proud of ourselves and our virtue signaling.
Right. The question I want to ask the audience is, do you think that there is any legitimacy in seeking to get rid of that person called Mr. Putin? No. Okay. So we're very firmly against regime change. All of us, yes, for reasons which have been expressed very, very broadly. Thank you so much. I think we're going to have to sort of move on. And I'm trying to think of a question which is going to be sort of be calm. And should we have a referendum on net zero? Marwan, yeah. Marwan? Marwan here? Could you ask a question? Yeah.
At the risk of sounding like a parrot, should we have a referendum on net zero?
Mark?
I think we're all a bit tired of referendums. I mean, we've just come out of very painful divides which haven't quite gone away, if we're honest. There is so much research which shows that most of the public appreciate that climate change is happening and that we need to deal with this constructively. I think net zero in some ways doesn't go far enough because it's net zero, it's not zero emissions, it's net zero. So there are issues with that. So no, absolutely, from my point of view, I don't think so at all. I don't think we need to divide people, I think we need to unite. And climate change is one of those things where whether you're Lib Dem or Conservative or obviously Green and all the other parties, we should be uniting on this issue, not stoking division. Does that mean that we shouldn't take into account the impact that renewable energy could have on our own wallets, on the cost of living crisis? Obviously, we should think about that, and we need to try and manage the impact of that. But there's no way around it. We need to invest in renewable energy for the jobs of the future, for the jobs of now. A referendum won't solve that. That's a conversation that needs to happen between us all.
John?
So I absolutely agree. We should not have a referendum on net zero or any other difficult policy issue. The Brexit was a very, very special case where opinion is very, very finely balanced, and it's been causing us problems for years and years in Parliament, but it's not something that we should make a habit of for the reasons that Mark said. It's a complex policy issue, but we are headed in that direction. That's where we want, I think we all agree that's more or less where we want to get for reasons of climate change. What I would observe is about nuclear power. And one of the terrible things we've done is not come up with a solution for the management of nuclear waste. And yet in 1999, the House of Lords wrote a report and said what we need is a deep geological depository. And we've made glacial progress in there. And if we'd had done something about a deep geological depository really active in 1999, by now we would have a proper deep geological depository. So those who have problems understandable problems about the management of nuclear waste, we could take them on a train, go 3 kilometres underneath the Earth's crust to a very large cavern and say, this is where we're going to stick the nuclear waste. By the way, it's vitrified and it's in a stainless steel flask with a lid welded on. Please explain how you think that the stuff's going to get out. So we've made painful progress on the management of nuclear waste. And on nuclear power stations, what we've done is had a whole stream of different power stations, none of them the same. And actually what we need to do is have a standard design that we rubber stamp. And as we keep making another one to the same design, just as we do with ships, when you make several ships of exactly the same design, each ship is much cheaper to make than the last one.
Peter.
Can I let Toni speak? I'll explain later, but perhaps Toni could speak first.
If you would like.
So I really think that, you know, we're in 2022. Are we still really having the conversation about whether we need to get to net zero? It's not when, it's how. And it's, you know, we don't need a referendum to tell us that. I totally agree that referenda over complex issues, giving binary choices over complex issues, it doesn't work. I would, you know, state the Brexit referendum as a good example of that. I think, you know, we, as a nation, we understand climate change is happening. I'm dismayed that our own MP is still in kind of denial about that and saying that one of the things, one of the most appalling things that I heard was that he actually said, I understand that climate change is happening, I don't believe it's a threat to life. I would like to say that he clearly isn't thinking about people in other parts of the world where their very existence is threatened by climate change. He's not thinking about waves of refugees. In fact, Peter, you'll know that climate change was a factor in the Syrian conflict. It absolutely is a threat to life. When we're talking about water and food then becoming an issue, it's very much a threat to life. I think it's very easy to sit in a very comfortable position and say that's somebody else's problem or it's one for further down the road. It's not. And with COVID, we have shown that when we adopt a mindset of understanding that there is an emergency, we can move mountains. And this is not an option. This is not something that we can say, we don't think it's going to happen, so we're just going to not look at it. It's happening anyway, and we need to start taking that seriously. And I think it's not a lack of understanding, it's a lack of political will to act on the understanding.
Sure. Thank you.
Well, I'm for a referendum on democratic grounds. And I wanted to hear the 3 other speakers because it illustrates the situation. It's a stitch-up between the main political parties. The people don't have a choice. You can have different shades of green. Now, you may be right in that choice, but it's a sad situation where the voting public don't have a say on one of the major issues of the day. Rather similar to Brexit. All the parties wanted to stay in. There were different flavors of the same pro-EU stance. But at the end of the day, a majority of the people, as was shown in the referendum, felt strongly enough to want to leave. And we have to have some respect for the people. The people are superior to the elites. That's an important lesson.
I'm a teacher. I am a person. I would just like to say, first of all, so I'm not a career politician. I'm not a member of the elite. I'm a parent with children who are growing up in this environment. I sit here as a member of this community, a lifelong member of this community, watching our MP say things that affect my children's future, affect the lives of the children. We are holding this world until we hand it over to the young people sitting here. I feel that as a responsibility, and I absolutely take issue. I completely understand and agree with the right of the people to be represented. That's why I push for electoral reform. I don't feel that our electoral system is representative in the way that it should be. But I take issue. I mean, what would your question be for a referendum? What would you put on the ballot paper?
And also, can I add to that?
Do you agree that net zero should be a target for whatever year it's supposed to be?
Could someone come back with saying something about whether or not you think a referendum is truly a democratic process?
Please go ahead.
It is a democratic process, but it's not a very good one. Peter referred to the stitch-up with the EU, and for years and years and years, in Parliament, the conventional wisdom was that we should stay in the EU, and it was actually the democratic process that made the pressure on the Conservative Party became too great not to have a referendum, because we were at risk of losing an election to the people like the Brexit Party and Michael Farage. So democracy forced us to have a referendum. But then when we look at this issue, we've got to ask the question, well, what do we mean by net zero? And do we mean, how do we treat nuclear power? Because I don't know where Toni is on nuclear power, but she might not be a great supporter of nuclear power. But I would say electricity generated by nuclear power is zero carbon, or very low carbon. There is actually a carbon content of nuclear power. So that's a really difficult question. Is nuclear power net zero or not? And that then really makes the question, should we have net zero or not? It's too simplistic. And the beauty of our Parliament is that, yes, you have ding-dongs in the Chamber of the House or ding-dongs in the House of Commons, but actually what happens is parliamentarians sit down in committees, in meetings, privately, and we debate amongst ourselves what the right answer is, and we get there. Sometimes it's slow, sometimes it's imperfect, sometimes we actually come up with the wrong answer, like invading Iraq, but actually when you look at the alternatives to a proper parliamentary democracy, those alternatives are far worse.
Mark?
A bit like Brexit, what would the end result of this be? Would we say, well, actually, we're not going to have let's say, for example, most people voted against net zero. So what then? Do we just ignore climate change and we just try and find some other way to fudge it? There's a debate to be had in terms of who should pay for the transition. And there's a very important debate in terms of that, because a lot of the costs in terms of investing in wind power, for example, were passed on to our electricity bills. And do I believe that people who are suffering, who are barely able to feed themselves and their children, barely able to put fuel in their car, should pay for solar panels and wind turbines and everything else? No, I don't believe that. I think we can find better models. And now that the cost of producing solar panels, of all sorts of technologies, hydrogen, perhaps nuclear, all sorts of things we will have to consider as a country, the cost of these things are going down. I'm not necessarily the biggest fan of nuclear, because there are huge risks to it, as you mentioned, but that could potentially be in some way a part of the mix of the future. Hydrogen. There are options, and we need to look at the different cost models for everything, but to say that we should just ignore things because they are too expensive, too difficult, too hard, is that the kind of country we are? We find innovative solutions. That's what Britain's about.
I think Peter might argue that debates in committees in the House of Lords and the House of Commons is a question of the elite deciding what the rest of the country should have. But Peter, can I ask you to very shortly, briefly, answer the point that was made by John, which is that referendum clearly is a democratic process, but is not a very good one.
Well, apparently the Swiss think it's a good one because they have referenda every few months on issues of the moment. And as far as I'm aware, Switzerland is a proud democracy. Why this fear of letting the people have a say, a direct say? They used to have it in that fount of democracy, ancient Greece. But I noticed that the need for a referendum comes especially when you're not given a choice by the main political parties. I mean, that is just simply a fact that on this issue, the environment, climate, all the parties are basically saying the same thing. So anybody who thinks differently can just go hang. Let's follow Switzerland's example. Let the people have a say.
All right, let the people have a say. John, one sentence.
Peter, 30 or 40 years
You can't
ago,
ask him a question because it's one sentence.
What I'd love to know whether Peter could say, 30 or 40 years ago, what would be the result of a referendum on capital punishment?
Don't answer that. Because most of us know the answer. I'm going to ask Kirav Singh to ask a question. Kira? Thank you.
Hello all. My question is, in the light of the Euro 2020 final, Twitter reported taking down 1,900 racist tweets. Should the government introduce more powers to control social media?
Tony, shall I read the question? Thank you so much. In the light of the Euro 2020 final, Twitter reported taking down 1,900 racist tweets. Should the government introduce more powers to control social media? And to give you a tiny minute to think, I was at a lecture the day before yesterday with a group of philosophers, and the consensus was that perhaps the biggest danger that we face in this country, and indeed the world, is how to control the internet. So over to you, Toni.
Yeah, so first of all, that was something, that the racism that was very much at the fore through the Euros was something that was just appalling. And absolutely we need to be combating that. It's how. And I believe fundamentally in all things that where there is an individual freedom, there's also a responsibility. And I do believe that there has to be, there have to be kind of checks and balances in place. I think saying that we have absolute freedom of expression, when my freedom to express myself impinges on somebody else's freedom to live, or to live free from abuse or harassment, then is that true freedom? So I absolutely believe that there need to be further checks and balances, but how that happens in a way that doesn't then impinge too greatly on freedom of speech. I think it's a broader thing. I think ultimately, as everyone sitting here, you're engaged with education, and for a long time of working in education, one of the things I've been really passionate about is making sure that you're acutely aware when you're working with young people that you've got the future growing in front of you, and it's a massive responsibility to kind of help those young people to grow in a way that makes the world a better place. Not to teach them what to think, but to teach them how to think, so that you can kind of make an investment in the future. So I think it's a broader issue. I absolutely think that social media is a massive part of that, but I think that we need to be working on that more holistically as well.
I think the big issue is how you preserve free speech, freedom of expression, and control social media. I mean, it's a hugely difficult problem. Peter?
I don't like this word control. Sorry, my instincts go towards freedom. Of course, there has to be an element of restraint, but there are already laws governing hate speech and incitement to violence. Isn't this enough? Why do we have to control free speech. An example, the other day Facebook suspended the account of an eminent British professor who'd had the temerity to retweet an article by the Mail on Sunday, an investigative article into one aspect of the COVID crisis, which didn't quite fit with the government narrative. That is sinister. That's what we should be worried about. That's clamping down.
John.
As you'd expect, I'm a very strong supporter of free speech, and including the right to offend, but not the right to incite, and particularly violence. To my view, the real problem with it is the anonymity, the fact that you can say something publicly, but anonymously, and nobody knows you said it. So I think we've got to do something about that. The other issue is, as Peter touched on, the role of social media to censor. Positively, they've done some censoring in respect of the situation in Ukraine, so we would presumably would support that. But then Peter's talked about the difficulties where they've done some censoring, which probably none of us on the panel would support.
Yeah, yes, that's absolutely. Mark.
I have to agree with John. I think this debate about freedom and social media is a bit of a distraction from the issue, the core issue as I see it. These social media companies are profiting huge amounts from whatever we say, whether you're left or right or somewhere in the middle. They are making money all the time from you saying anything at all. And yet there's no responsibility. There's no, I mean, they don't pay tax or hardly any tax anywhere. Facebook has many employees here. Twitter has many employees. They have a little office in Ireland, and I've been past their sort of postbox office. They don't pay much tax there, not here, not anywhere. Due to a quirk of US legislation, if you look into it, in the 90s to simulate the development of the internet, the World Wide Web, the internet companies were given protections that newspapers, that television stations, broadcasters weren't given, where they are basically not liable for anything that's posted on their networks. And is that fair? What if let's say the Mail on Sunday were to tomorrow post a completely fallacious article with some, I don't know, COVID hoax or something like that? We would rightly be angry. There would be legislation, regulation involved. But for some reason, you can say whatever you like on Twitter, on Facebook. And then they can only intervene when they feel like it. Is that realistic? Is that what we want for our teenagers, for ourselves, for these huge companies to have so much power to influence how we think, what we say, with no restrictions?
I think in a way that's the point. Is it's not. It's not necessarily the giving freedom to people to be able to say what they like on social media. It's the social media oligarchs who are controlling it, and they're the ones who actually have got a huge commercial interest in this, and that is the part of it which I think is extremely worrying. We could go on forever and ever, but we're not going to go on because we're going to ask Andy Bass to ask his question.
Good evening, hello. Looking at my simple question now, I see that the debate has ranged through the basics of our democracy, and recently you've just been talking about the power of the internet, and we've also touched upon our Prime Minister's moral stance. So I'd be interested to see where you go with this one. Is honesty and the concept of truth irrelevant in the conduct of politics today?
That's designed for Peter. It's honesty and the concept of truth irrelevant to the conduct of politics today.
Good question. Obviously, truth should be very important. People are adults. They realize that politicians are more or less obliged to deceive them, to be economical with the truth. Let's not get too stuck up about this and unrealistic. But truth I think the political class do have a problem with truth. Churchill famously said that the truth is so important that it must be guarded by a pack of lies. When you think about it, that's a profoundly cynical and reprehensible way of thinking. And this from our national hero and Johnson's hero. So let's use our own judgment on this. And let us try to hold our politicians to greater, higher standards of truth. And there is so much misinformation about at the moment, and it's not the misinformation that you think. It's not the misinformation from Russia that we can't even access because the Russian channels have been blocked, such as our attachment to free speech, that we've stopped our public even being able to hear what the Russian misinformation is, unless they delve into the recesses of the internet. God forbid. No, the misinformation comes, for example, from omission. When the government slapped sanctions on Russia, I don't remember them telling us that actually they were going to backfire on us and that petrol was going to be going through the roof. No, they were economical with the truth. They must have known, surely. But no, when they were making the announcement, when they were doing their virtue signaling, they kept back this important information from the people. Well, now we know. So the lesson is, people stay awake.
Yes.
And look, not just for the lie, but for the omission.
A good point. John?
No, it's essential. When I speak and operate in the House of Lords, I do so very clearly on my personal honour. When I'm talking both in the chamber, which is absolutely on the record, but when also I'm having discussions privately, I would never seek to mislead another member of the House of Lords or the member of the House of Commons by saying something that I knew or should have known was not true. And by acting in that way, I have the confidence of other members of the House of Lords, and I think you need to do something useful to do a test of the effectiveness of a member of the House of Lords. And the question to be asked is not how often they speak, how often they attend, but one of the questions to ask is, can they win a division in the House of Lords against their own party? It's quite difficult to do, and I have done that. I got the Labour Party and the Liberal Democrats to vote with me on an extremely controversial issue. But I like to think the reason why they did that was that they had confidence in me, and it's the way I conducted myself in public life at that time over about 25 years. They had 25 years of experience of me, how I conducted myself, how I dealt with ministers when I was an opposition front-bench spokesman, whether I did the dirty on them or whether I acted properly and in accordance with the 7 principles of public life. So the answer is no. There is an issue, though, that the media will ask politicians loaded questions to which there is no right answer. They want it to be a binary answer, but there is no right answer. One amusing thing that happened, I was on a TV program with Nicky Chapman, and he asked this wicked loaded question, and I said, he asked, why has this happened? And I said, lack of moral courage at the highest level in government, which wasn't the answer he expected.
Yeah, can you say in one word what the controversial issue was? I'm sure everyone is dying to know.
The issue was press regulation and implementing the Leveson reforms.
Right. Mark, thank you.
I think that the level of debate has really declined in the last few years in particular. I think we can all agree it's got quite rough. And I think more than ever, we've seen government, and particularly I would say this government, being very economical with the truth. And I don't think they realise the damage they're doing to our democratic institutions. You can have debate about left or right or centre or something else entirely, but you are undermining people's confidence in the whole system, the way we live our liberal democratic society, when you are dishonest. And I think that is what has happened. And it's a great shame to see someone like, Attlee. I have a lot of respect for him and for many other Conservative colleagues, and you think, we should go back to the issues about debating policies, not about trying to lie about them or trying to sort of fudge things. It doesn't help. Long term, we know what happens in other countries when you are economical with the truth. You see all these institutions fall apart, and we should not think that because we're in Britain and we've had this parliament for 1,000 years that couldn't happen here. It will happen.
Toni, you've got 1 minute to see us out.
Oh my goodness, right. Okay, so I largely agree with what Mark said, actually, and I really believe that, as I said, I came into politics largely because I felt that the standard of discourse in public life had really degenerated. And I think that's a really dangerous path. As Mark said, I don't think you can take our democracy as sacrosanct. I think it's something you have to respect and you work for every day and you fight for it every day. It is not something that's a God-given right that we have that, that will never be tarnished. And we can see the effect of this Conservative government. Now, I take issue again, I have to say, Peter, with this, when you're talking about the political class. I think, when you're talking about that, you're kind of creating, it's a bit dangerous in some ways, I have to say, respectfully. I think we really have to be better at disagreeing amiably and respectfully with one another. We need to be ensuring that we have high standards in public life. But I think creating this kind of separation, I'm a single parent, a teacher. I came into politics after 5 years of being asked to stand. And the reason that I didn't stand was because I felt that politicians in some way were some other class. But the thing is that there's a whole load of young people sitting here who I really hope are going to go out and change the world. And if they think that politicians are somehow somewhere separate from them and that is unattainable, that's not going to happen. I think that's really dangerous.
That's
so I'm going to challenge that.
Wonderful note to end on. I'm so sorry, I had strict instructions to stop by 8:15, it's 8:51. So thank you so much. Thank you, all of you. I mean, as I say, it's lovely to see you. But thank you so much, Toni, Peter, and John, and Mark, for a lovely discussion. We could spend the next 3 days, but, we don't have the next 3 days. So thank you so much. I'm not sure what happens now.
Thank you to everyone for coming out tonight. It has been a turbulent 3 years for JHGS Question Time. In 2020, despite the event being oven ready for launch, we had to cancel due to the first national lockdown. As a student organising committee, we feel immensely grateful to have welcomed you to JHGS and to share this great evening with you. Due to the pandemic, Question Time was organised at fairly late notice. And although we faced challenges, the committee has worked immensely hard to bring you the event we have witnessed tonight. Sadly, the Right Honourable Richard Thompson MP was unable to join us due to an unfortunate run-in with the coronavirus. However, he has assured us he will be with us next year, and we look forward to hosting him at JHGS Question Time 2023. Please can you join me in thanking Andrew, Ewan, James and Dan for their work on the student committee. Also, Mr. Parbury for his advice and support throughout the organisation of the event, operating behind the scenes and ensuring communication ran smoothly. All the staff and the students of the JHGS Politics Department. And our great AV team in the booth behind you. The Men in Black and the Prefect teams who have guided you and provided your refreshments this evening. And one more, the site team, for their involvement in helping us set up the hall, clear the space, prep the stage, prep the lights. And finally, please can you give one final round of applause to tonight's panel? And we're now going to do some gifts. So can the student panel please make their way to the front? Thank you to the student panel. And I'm going to ask you to do it one more time. Can we get another round of applause for our main panel? Baroness D'Souza, Toni Brodelle, Peter Ford, Lord Attlee, and Mark. Planning for 2023 is already underway, and as you have been such a well-behaved audience, we do hope you'll join us next year when JHGS Question Time returns. We wish you a safe journey home, and once again, please give a round of applause for our chair and our panelists. Thank you and good night.